So our speaker tonight is Enzo Morelli Mora. He is with the University of Montana. He has a master's degree in forestry from the university and is working on his PhD. He is a conservation biologist who, as well as being a student and a researcher, serves as the director of undergraduate research at the University of Montana. And Enzo has been a really key participant in this cadre of conservation scientists around the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation that are working on conservation and restoration of this species. And his own particular focus is long-term monitoring of restoration projects. So I'm going to mute myself and turn things over to Enzo Morelli Mora. Welcome, Enzo. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gretchen, and thank you everyone for being here. Before I pull up my slides, I completely forgot that I need to change my outfit. I need to move from director to Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation volunteer and steward. So hold me a second here and I'll get my slides ready. And please let me know if you can see my end of the screen. All right, let's see. What can somebody give me some feedback on what you see on your end?
We see a slide that says white bark pine in a changing mountain landscape.
Great. Does it have the presenter notes in it or it's just the slides?
I don't see any presenter notes.
Perfect. We're good to go. All righty. One sec here. Get everything ready on my end. Cool. Okay, so hi everyone. Thanks for having me again. As Gretchen mentioned, I'm Enzo Martelli Moya, and tonight I'm here on behalf of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, where I serve with the Education and Communication Committee. And I'm also the editor of the Nutcracker Notes now that Bob King took the leave after Steve Arnold for a few years. And my goal tonight is to, rather than sharing a species overview, which I would imagine many of you have heard pretty well with this iconic species, I want to focus more on how we think ecologically about restoring whitebark pine and reviewing some of the methods we're currently developing to guide restoration. And it's been a very, very long process on testing techniques or whatnot, and it's a really exciting career path. Okay, so let's see. And first of all, I'd like to start by briefly referencing the foundation. The Whitebark Pine Foundation was founded by many of the early scientists and managers who recognized the decline of whitebark pine in the, I'd say, late 80s as a response from the first whitebark pine working group that was organized in Montana State University in 1998. And shortly after, by suggestion of, I don't know if you might not heard, Dana Perkins from Idaho, and the leadership of Diana Tombach, the foundation got established in 2001, about the same year that the book Whitebark Pine Communities got also published as a result of this initial effort on consolidating and summarizing everything we knew at the time about the ecology and potential management of the species. So the foundation works to support restoration science, coordinate across agencies, fund student research. I got funded a couple of years ago, and it was structural for publishing my first research on whitebark pine restoration, and provide educational research like what I'm doing right now, including partnerships that help bring the documentary that we're going to see in the second half of this presentation. So in terms of whitebark pine and what makes it a community architect and also my favorite species, I'll keep this brief since the documentary covers much of it. But whitebark pine is a structurally and functionally dominant species in the high elevation system, arguably the most attractive of all the timberline species, but of course, some would say that I'm a little bit biased, and that's completely right. But regardless, it has been shared over and over, the strong influence this species has on the hydrology of the high elevation systems and all the cascading effects this has, helping with the snowpack retention, but also the gradient snowmelt. Among other effects this species has is being also the main food source of many iconic wildlife, including grizzly bears, black bears, squirrels, you call it, basically everything that is living up there. And a key character in the establishment of successional trajectories. That's probably one of my favorite key aspects of whitebark pine, that since it's considered primary species, is the first one that gets established and also lead the way and nurse other species to establish afterwards. However, the reason why whitebark pine is probably most known by is because of the unique mutualistic this species has developed with a corvid called Clark's nutcracker, which is a dependent mutualistic relationship where whitebark pine wouldn't be out there in the majority if it wouldn't be because of this corvid and not necessarily the other way around. And the critical role that this nutritious sheet rich cone have as a food source for this high elevation ecosystem. One of the main things that I enjoy telling when I get to do tabling events out there and talk to kiddos and talk to people that have heard from these species for the first time is just letting them know that a single cone, that it's not a third of the size of a human hand, could be up to 1,800 calories, sometimes 2,000 calories, and that's pretty much a full meal. And when we're trying to scale that up to a multiplicity of cones per tree, mature trees, of course, and then at a landscape scale, you start to identify like how critical this food source is across all the different scales of organizational scales on these systems. However, it is great to go up there without getting distracted by the gentle, almost soothing call of a nutcracker. So when you get to see these species up there and the importance of it, it's almost impossible not to do the same with its counterpart, the Clark's nutcracker. So it's always a mutualistic relationship in who gets the attention as much as also who gets to support the ecosystem. But as many other keystone vulnerable species, whether these are trees, mammals, you call them, whitebark pine is no strange to disturbances and has been profoundly affected in the last century. And there are four main drivers of change. Diana Tombach, one of the most renowned scientists on whitebark science, call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse of whitebark pine. And unfortunately, these four, they don't operate independently. They reinforce each other's, and these are widely known by some people, but some other probably not. The first one is white pine blister rust, which is known to weaken the trees and unfortunately affects the entire phenology of them. So it could attack baby trees all the way from being just a couple inches big seedlings all the way to mature like over a meter of diameter in girth trees and affecting essentially like the entire population of it. The second one is a native beetle, mountain pine beetle, that evolved also as well as the Clark nutcracker with this species, with this slight difference that in previous decades, with warming temperatures or warming winters in this case, the life cycle of this mountain pine beetle has gotten in a way enhanced, surviving over winter and giving it another chance to increase its population by numbers without necessarily killing them over winter, which creates a higher potential of having an outbreak every other year. And when it happens big time, creating an outstanding mortality across the entire landscape. And the fourth one, also as a resulting, or at the least correlated with the increasing temperatures in this part of the world, is the increment in the frequency but also intensity of wildfires in areas where whitebark pine has also been potentially encroached by over 100 years of fire suppression management, at the least in this part of the world. And as I was saying, the cumulative effect of all these fourth stressors reshape the community structure, not just on its abundance and richness of it, but also on how we get to see it every time that one of these stressors comes around and wipes out yet another side of the population and yet another side of the population until it gets diminished to the bare minimum. And I like sharing these pictures of like actually getting to see the blister rust cankers and also the mountain pine beetle individual because it brings perspective. One, difficult to see from a human side standpoint when you're like standing right next to one of these biggies and you're barely a ant standing right next to them, but also like getting to see the scale of the destruction that such small stressor produce. That is not just within a single stand, but also at a landscape level or even regional level. And after 100 years of like all these effect, it's way beyond that. We're talking about millions and millions of acres affected. So how the threats interact ecologically and why it's important to consider it for restoration effort, it's probably one of the most um, challenging problems of today's conservation and restoration of these species, but also other white pine five-needle species. And there are a few important aspects to consider when this. As I was mentioning, the blister rust reduces cone production before mortality when it affects or gets into the branches that are potentially cone-bearing branches, reducing the fitness of them and inevitably like reducing the potential harvest on a yearly basis per tree. And we're talking about the mature trees, so those that are way above 50 to 70 years old that are not the most like the ones that are most numbered out there. Also, the beetles remove mature seed sources, and that's something that differentiates the mountain pine beetle from blister rust, that unlike the invasive pathogen, the native beetle mostly or predominantly attacked higher diameter trees. So when we're looking at them both together, um, the effect on these populations in terms of mortality is predominantly weighted on the trees that will produce or potentially produce the majority of the cones, all the way down to seedlings in the case of blister rust. Then the fire removes surviving resistant trees, if there are any left, or even those that are affected but not fully dead. And the climate stress reduces the seedling survival and potentially increasing the vulnerability of those that are already stressed by all these other potential, like all these other factors acting together. So the collective result of this is essentially a landscape scale seed limitation, a landscape that has moved from a heterogeneous patch rich with different areas with cone production into a more homogeneous with barely few trees resisting and producing cones on every other year basis. And this interferes with the species' capacity to regenerate on its own. But we need to remember another element. Whitebark pine does not disperse by itself. It doesn't have a dehiscent cone. So it depends on this corvid to get a chance to put the seeds out there. We're talking about heavy seeds, if I'm not wrong, is the biggest seeds from a conifers on this side of the Northwestern Rockies. We do have other bigger ones. It's in the Sierras, if I'm not wrong, with sugar pine and coulter pine and a few other ones. But the seed on its own doesn't travel far if it gets to get out of the cone by chance. So when we're reducing the cone production capacity of a stand, we're not just reducing the capacity of the species to disperse on the area, we also reduce them, in a way, say, marketability of the stands to bring Clark's nutcracker and inhabit the stand for harvesting cones. So the less cones we produce, the less attractive the stands becomes from Clark's nutcracker, and hence we reduce abruptly the potential regeneration dynamics of the species. Um, So, as I was saying, whitebark pine persistent depends on one cone-bearing trees, not just a few, but ideally the vast majority at the stand level. Nutcracker dispersal, which is inevitably depending on how many cones are produced by year or in a respective year. Successful seedling establishment, which is for me is the biggest miracle of the existence of whitebark pine that is not necessarily deterministic. We're talking about the result of something around 15 or like 1,500 cash produced by year by bird at a landscape level without a clear how to say concentration around the landscape. And out of those that get to not be retrieved by the bird, if they happen to be at the right place at the right time with the right amount of light and humidity, they could get to germinate. But from moving from germination to establishment, um, it's a completely whole deal. So when we're looking at a tree and we're thinking that the vast majority, if not all of the trees that you get to see in a stand were accidentally planted by Clark's nutcracker, then you get to see the importance of this mutualistic dependency. So disrupting this cycle not just disrupt the potential of the species to disperse, it actually affects the entire community organization. And we're going to get into that in a second. So as I was saying, the consequence of these interacting disruptions disrupt the dynamic at a community level, which is losing a multi-cohort of stands, which simplifies in a way the structural composition of the species. We're mostly losing all the older trees, the ones that has the higher capacity for producing cones. And with these fewer cone-bearing trees per hectare, we reduce the potential habitat use for Clark's nutcracker, which in a sense reduces as well the potential regeneration of clusters. Increasing the use of these release niches, and by release niches, I'm just talking about the areas that were previously used by whitebark pine, now being colonized by other competing conifers. Most commonly known or most commonly happened as shade competing conifers such as subalpine fir, Engelmann spruce, in certain cases lodgepole pine, but not so much on the higher ends of the elevational distribution. Altering the ridge top connectivity, and most importantly, something that often gets not mentioned, altering the fuel distribution in high elevation, leaving the system even more vulnerable to high mortality due to wildfires. So in the end, this is not just mortality, it is community reorganization, something that can potentially be not reversible if we don't do something about it, which set up the need for restoration tools, which is what I'm going to be reviewing before we get into the community part of the presentation. So I'm going to present you on what we believe are the 5 mostly used current tools, being the first one, genetic resistance screening. So as I was saying, blister rust is a non-native or invasive rust that was introduced in the early 1900s. From Asia, and we have no cure to this blister rust, as much as we did with the blight on the eastern forests. And our best strategy is to increase the frequency of resistant genotypes on the landscape while preserving diversity. And unfortunately, this is the foundation of the whitebark pine current restoration and the future of the species conservation. No other strategy can currently outpace or resist the effect of the blister rust infection. No silvicultural treatments, no prescribed burning, no planting of non-resistant trees, because at a time when those trees are older, if they don't have a resistant in their genes, it only takes one spore to colonize their cambium. However, it comes with a caveat. Doing genetic resistance screening is not fast and it's not cheap. Most of the time, the process follows as trying to identify an area that has been previously affected and trying to identify which of the individuals in that stand have survived to a certain degree the effect of the rust. Sometimes they don't show any sort of cankers or symptoms. Sometimes they do, and they resist or recover from them. After that process happens, there are 2 chances. One is waiting until the tree produces cones and collecting the cones and raising those seedlings. Or the other option is collecting, this is a newer approach, collecting a piece of the needles, running a genetic screening, and see if there are any genetic markers that could be correlated with some sort of resistance, which is the work that is taking place right now. But so far, the traditional approach is identifying those trees that are called plus trees, waiting until they produce cones, collecting those cones, raising those seedlings, exposing those seedlings to the rust again, and seeing which one of them shows show like a higher level of resistance and don't get killed, basically. And from those are the ones that later on will be even more cones collected and will be produced or will be harvested for seed production. So it's a process that you can imagine takes multiple years, and that's just with one tree. And the goal is trying to capture as much genetic diversity across the entire distribution of the species. So it's a ginormous effort that we're trying to entail. But again, as I was saying, it's the only one to date that we know can sustain the populations long term. Tool number 2 is seed orchards and nurseries. Nursery infrastructure is one of our most important allies because though there is where the seedlings are coming from, because it allows scaling restoration. So we're moving from just a restoration treatment trial all the way to multiple hectares efforts at a time. However, to date, we depend on a few major nurseries to sustain the bulk of the restoration efforts that are happening at federal organizations, like the Coeur d'Alene Nursery. And seed orchards are another great alternative to produce noun-resistant stock, yet it's also limited in capacity. And this is one that it's also probably not as commonly known, but whitebark pine is subjected to masting dynamics, which means that they don't produce the same amount of cones every year. And sometimes it takes multiple years to get to see a really good cone harvest. Tool number 3, strategic planning. What do we refer by this? It's kind of like a generic name on it, ain't it? Well, for whitebark pine planting, it's not just about density. It's not like planting dog fir, or it's not like planting lodgepole pine. It's about placement. When we think about the natural regeneration strategy of whitebark pine, we need to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, that it depends primarily on the nutcracker caches. We know that nutcrackers are pretty similar just in visually. It's just for exemplary purposes. They're not that different from a chicken in the sense that like they collect the seeds and they put them in their pouch, or they keep it in their pouch, and they could hold like multiple tens of seeds in there and start flying all over the landscape, creating this catch with 1 to sometimes even 15 seeds each. And under the conditions that I mentioned before, some of these caches could regenerate. So what I was saying is like only when the right environmental conditions, if the bird hasn't retrieved the cache, and if the cache hasn't been pilfered by rodents, it might get to germinate. And most of the time, this happens when the cache also happens to be placed right next to what we call a microsite, right next to a big log, right next to a big stone, you call it. So operationally, we aim to rebuild seed production individuals across the landscape, and it's especially important in areas that are approaching to seed limitations or approaching to stands that the majority of the cone-bearing trees are starting to die. And for that reason, when we're planting every seedling, the location matters. So that's specifically this strategic planting means. Tool number 4, direct seeding. Direct seeding is a novel, or at the least an emerging approach for this species. It's pretty common for other like grasses or whatnot. And that expands restoration into remote terrain. As you may be informed, the vast majority of the whitebark pine distribution is within wilderness areas, areas that we're not allowed to bring machinery, and they're pretty far off from the trailheads. And most of these crews that are doing restoration work for organizations that only have so many hours to get to their place and do what they need to do to restore a species. So where planting or only other approaches is not viable or operational is where direct seedings could potentially succeed. It mimics natural regeneration processes and may become critical when planting access is limited, as I was mentioning. In other words, when it takes too many hours, or you cannot carry 200 seedlings for that long of a stretch. But some of the challenges or current challenges are, as I mentioned, rodent pilferage. Elizabeth Pansing from American Forest and Diana Tombach from CU Denver have spearheaded the research on this. And some of the numbers that they found is that in areas close to Glacier National Park, they found that sometimes up to 50% of more of the cache were pilfered by rodents. So that means that some of the coming challenges will be trying to figure out ways to understand seasonal and yearly rodent population dynamics that will help us that would help us to know when and where we'd have a better chance at those seeds to survive. Sometimes they will have to survive for multiple years before they even get to germinate. So yes, it is a promising strategy, but also one that is really risky in terms of how much are we taking back, or how much are we losing due to rodents or any other species. And tool number 5 is the model for restoration across the table. Proactive work is the key when the species collapses potential, and that is the case of whitebark pine, where the majority of the populations are on decline, and we've lost populations, and I would say way over 50% of the distribution. And for this reason, we now prioritize maintaining functional system before rust dominates the stands, and this includes mapping and identifying healthier regions where these techniques should be applied first. So, in other words, areas where we know that the stand is still at a decent health level and potential crop production. And as I mentioned, when we start thinking about techniques relative to restoration, we realize that restoration is not just tree planting. It's rebuilding ecological function at a landscape scale based on the dynamics that makes the species subsist in a long-term basis. And that includes structural complexity, seed flow, wildlife interactions, in this case with the Clark nutcrackers, among other ones. So we'll talk about the ecological structure and functionality rebuilding of whitebark pine. And to bring this from a framework to live work, I like to shift to a short documentary called Hope and Restoration, Saving the Whitebark Pine. This production highlights the species, most importantly the people, and the partnerships working on restoration, including incredible footage from high elevation landscape and the different organisms that relied on whitebark pine communities. This film was co-produced by the Cornell Lab Ornithology Center for Conservation Media and the Ricketts Conservation Foundation in association with American Forests and the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. As you watch, I'd invite you to listen for the same thread we discussed and what healthy function looks like place by place and how restoration tries to rebuild it. So hold me a second and I'm gonna share the screen for the documentary. All right, can somebody tell me if you see a dark screen on your end?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna play, and if somebody can confirm that in a couple of seconds you're receiving the sound, that would be fantastic.
The evidence is abundant and irrefutable that people are drawn to wild
Yep, we got it.
Thank you.
There's something that resonates in the human soul, in our human condition. And there is a particular resonance that comes from having whitebark pine forests present. It is unique within a landscape that's unique. It has a sense of timelessness because you are walking through a forest of trees that are hundreds of years old. And what they offer on the landscape can't be replicated. It can't be duplicated in a short period of time. In a culture that seems to gravitate to the immediate, there is a longevity, a permanence that you find in whitebark pine forests that, even if we can't fully express it, draws us in.
The thing that I admire and appreciate the most about whitebark pine is its tenacity. You see this thing growing on the most amazing ridge tops and in these environments where no other tree can exist.
We've been working with whitebark pine for several years now, and I think of it like our people. Our people have survived. Our people are resilient.
There's something really magical about being in a really high elevation place that's really windy and really inhospitable, and to see these giant, beautiful things thriving.
Whitebark pine is almost exclusively a high elevation tree within its entire range. They're the craggy, gnarled trees that you see at timberline. They're that top layer to the forest in the mountains, all the way to the Sierras and Cascades and north into Alberta and British Columbia.
If you are going hiking at high elevations, you've probably passed a whitebark in the western United States and not known it. If you are going backcountry skiing, or if you're at many of the ski resorts in the western United States, you've probably skied past a whitebark and not known it.
Where whitebark pine grows, its canopies redistribute snow. The shade from their crowns will preserve that snow well into the summer.
These forests actually stabilize the snowpack, allowing the snow to melt slower and provide high-quality water for longer periods during the summer.
In this area, a lot of folks downstream rely on that snowmelt for their irrigation water, for their culinary water, to replenish the water in the water table.
Whitebark pine has so many benefits, but probably the most important ecosystem service that whitebark provides is a wildlife food source. A whitebark cone is about 4 or 5 inches long, and they are very sappy. But the magic is what's inside the cone.
Whitebark produces these unbelievably large seeds, the largest seed of any tree that we have in the Northern Rockies.
Because the cones are large with a big nut, a lot of animals rely on them, and the grizzly bears love it.
They're trying to put on fat for going into the den for a winter period. They need to gain as much weight as possible. And the whitebark pine offers them a large return for the energy expended to receive it. And we have enough data after many years of research to know that they are inexorably tied to the whitebark pine.
Hey, Bear. You're in the midst of a whitebark pine forest here. When it's a good whitebark year, this is a wildlife hub. So this is a real important area for bears, for red squirrels, but the nutcrackers are arguably the most spectacular.
I think that the most interesting thing about whitebark that really catches people's attention is the fact that the tree could not exist without this bird that plants its seeds.
Almost all the whitebark pine reproduction up and down the Rocky Mountain chain is due to nutcrackers caching the seeds. So this forest really depends on the bird.
The nutcracker will come along and remove the seeds from the cone. And then they bury small clusters of these seeds pretty much everywhere in the high mountain environment.
They stash these seeds, sometimes up to tens of thousands of caches, and no one can believe that they can recover these things, but they do. They don't get them all, though. And so some of those caches grow into whitebark pine, and most of whitebark pine is established that way. And so the two are intertwined. So it's a really very important relationship, and it's starting to fall apart. It's falling apart because the whitebarks are dying for multiple reasons. And it's exemplified here. Everything I look out and see as dead is whitebark.
Since the start of my career, the decline of whitebark pine is just breathtaking. In areas, we've lost over 90 to 95% of these trees.
I began to see whole entire upper watersheds die. It was heartbreaking to see that.
You go out there and it's really hard to find a healthy tree on the landscape. It's depressing. It's everything from these little tiny seedlings that are less than a foot tall all the way up to the biggest trees on the landscape. And every single one of them virtually has white pine blister rust.
Whitebark pine is facing extinction primarily because of white pine blister rust. White pine blister rust is this non-native fungus that infects a tree through its needles and slowly creates these cankers that then cut off the flow of nutrients and water, killing limbs. Over time, that spreads and will kill the entire tree.
This disease has been spreading through whitebark pine for nearly a century. This is the main existential threat to whitebark pine.
I think if you look back on some of the history of diseases like this, pathogens that have gone through North America, the classic case is chestnut blight, which came into the eastern U.S. in the late 1800s, and 40 years later, there were no American chestnut left in the forest.
If we fail to do anything for whitebark pine, we are going to end up with many regions of our high mountain areas without it, and we lose the ecosystem services, the wildlife food, the habitat protection, the watershed protection. It will be very apparent that some cataclysm affected our western forests mightily on a large scale.
I don't think I'll need it. So as we're coming in here to set up, we're looking for trees that we know to be genetically resistant to blister rust. So these are the ones we're going to be caging in today.
We have no cure for white pine blister rust, and the only recourse we have is to look for the small number of individuals in each population that seems to have natural genetic resistance. Those individuals are the foundation of restoring whitebark pine.
These cones will be shipped to the Coeur d'Alene nursery in Idaho and eventually used to grow seedlings in the nursery.
The seedlings we are growing have some level of resistance to blister rust. On average, we're growing about 150,000 seedlings per year. 150,000 one-year-old seedlings, 150,000 two-year-old seedlings.
When we plant trees, the first thing is we really look for an excellent planting location. We're looking for a log that's down or maybe a stump, something that's going to provide shade and hold some moisture and give it the best life and the best start that it can have.
It's very gratifying to go out and see these seedlings on the landscape. It is very humbling, I'll say, that we are having such an impact. And in the special case of whitebark pine, where this is a threatened species, we're able to recreate it and put it back on site.
I have a lot of hope for the future of whitebark pine because I see the passion in the people who are working to restore it. They're doing the research, planting trees, collecting cones, growing all the seedlings. And I look at all these marvelous, passionate, committed people, and I can't help but have hope.
We have a lot of people that care about the fate of this tree, but we're realistic because we've moved an inch and we know that we've got a mile to go.
I am incredibly optimistic about the future of whitebark. I am incredibly sad about what the landscape looks like currently, but I can't imagine looking at this as the death knells. It's not.
Restoration is totally possible. We've done it, we are doing it, and we'll continue to do it. I want to be able to leave something for the next generation so that they can participate and see what I'm seeing and experience what I experience. when you're up at that high elevation and you're sitting in a whitebark pine stand and the Clark nutcrackers are flying around, and it's magical. And I shouldn't be the only one who gets to experience that.
You got to think like, this is not just for me. It's for the future generation. The forestry program, for the first time in our history, planted 2,000 trees. I won't see those trees mature, but our grandchildren and our children are going to see those trees mature. And that's, to me, what it's all about.
About 90% of whitebark pine occurs on public lands in the United States. So it's critically important that we, as public land management agencies, are actively involved in whitebark pine conservation.
I think the responsibility to restore whitebark pine rests with us all. No matter where the pine grow, we all have an obligation to make sure that this species, which is just so critical for high elevation habitat, doesn't wink out on our watch.
The more that I've worked with whitebark, the more that I have hope. Because I understand now that there are things we can do about it. We have a plan forward. We know how to restore the species. Now we need the resources to do that. One of my favorite quotes, it goes, "The true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit."
That's exactly what I meant by the soothing and calm noise of a Clark's nutcracker call. Hold me 1 second while I share um, my final slides here. All righty, let's see. Can you see my screen well?
It looks like your screen, but it looks like it's just black.
It's been blanked out. And
Okay, let's see. But only with the slides, or could you see the documentary?
the documentary was terrific, but just now
Okay.
as you tried to share, it was
All right.
blacked.
Okay. All righty. I think I'd have it. Let's see. How about now?
Yep, we got it.
There it is.
All righty. Yeah, so like to conclude the presentation, I just would like to open at some of the other opportunities as foundation we offer to members or non-members to be part of this community and be part of this effort of spreading the word about whitebark pine and the hope for its restoration, and also like mentioning a little bit about what you can do on your end as well. That's probably one of the most common questions we get when we're tabling. And the best thing I can say, there is no better action to spread the word about the current condition of whitebark pine and supporting the current efforts that are taking place for restoration. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing here, spreading the word. And another easy way of doing it as well, besides becoming a member, which I'm not going to go over, is also like registering to a webinar series just like this one, where we focus on the ecology of and management of whitebark pine, but also of all the other 5-needle white pine species in the States. It's a webinar series that we started in 2021, We're turning 5 years in a couple of months, and it's one of the projects that I'm finally passing to a newer generation of graduate students. Today, we had a long-awaited presentation by Karen Newland, who was talking about what happens after you get a species into the Endangered Species Act. And Whitebark pine got listed in 2023, and it is the first tree species that ever get listed. That also comes with a whole bunch of new challenges and considerations for how we're going to be moving forward. So yes, thank you very much for your attention, and I would love to answer any question if you have any.
Thank you, Enzo. I'm going to stop the recording now and invite people to either type in the chat, or even you could unmute yourself and speak up, because we don't have that many zillions of people on the